Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Solar Energy for Climate Change Conference, a platform dedicated to harnessing the power of renewable energy in our fight against climate change. This conference is organized by Carbon Care InnoLab, and my name is John from Carbon Care InnoLab, and I'm honored to be your moderator for these insightful panel discussions. So this is actually our second day of the conference, and yesterday we discussed a bit about the digital and also technological solutions to maximize the opportunities from solar energy and renewable energy. And of course, this will lead to the increasing demand for the critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, etc. And then, however, on the other side, the extraction and processing of these minerals presents significant environmental and social challenges, including land degradation, water contamination, etc. And so we need a balanced policy that can address both environmental sustainability and also supply chain security. And today in our discussions, we will examine the critical role of sustainable mineral supply chains in supporting Asia's energy transition. And we are honored to have three speakers from different backgrounds to share with us their perspective and insights. Here we have our three panelists. Xin-Chuan Xuan, Director of Corporate Accountability and International Affairs of Environmental Rights Foundation. Matthew Bernard Stewart, the Program Officer of United Nations Inter-Regional Crime and Justice Research Institute. And also Pochai Labode, Southeast Asia Program Manager and Representative from Business and Human Rights Resources Center. So our panelists will have 10 minutes for their presentations, and then afterwards we will have the Q&A sections for our wider discussions. And for our audience, please feel free to leave your questions in the question and answer box so that we can address your questions in the discussions. Without further ado, may we first have our first panelist, Xin-Chuan Xuan, to present your insights and experience from your perspective. So can we have Xin-Chuan, please?
Yeah, hi, thank you very much, John, and thank you for having me. So I'm going to share my screen. There you go. Can you see it properly? Okay.
Yeah, it's open now. Maybe just change it to the presentation mode. Yeah, to full screen.
Yeah, got it. There we go. Right, so I'm here to share with you what I witnessed firsthand on the ground in Indonesia in terms of environmental impact and social impacts. Now, just for background, there are a lot of nickel industrial parks in Indonesia, and where I went to, which is what I'm about to share, is specifically to the island of Sulawesi and Maluku. And more specifically, it's the industrial park IMIP, and on the right-hand side, we have IWIP. So they are one of the largest nickel industrial parks in Indonesia at the moment. And what I'm going to share later on would be what I experienced there. But as you may know, a lot of these environmental and social impacts are similar across Indonesia, perhaps even in the Philippines as well. So in terms of environmental impacts, there are a lot from deforestation, water pollution, air pollution to biodiversity loss. But in the interest of time, I want to focus on water and air pollution. Now, these photos that you're seeing here are not, for instance, the rubbish on the road and the really dirty rivers and water. They aren't like part of the parks themselves. They are not inside the parks, but rather they're actually the villages around the parks, which means that whatever is going on in the parks, they're spilling into people's daily lives. For instance, the bottom left photo, that is the road that children take to school on a daily basis, and that looks like this. And the river on the top right-hand side, we actually saw children. I'm not sure if they're playing or washing in there, but like it is their normal. Like there are no clean rivers in that area, so this is where they have fun. These photos now you see here are provided by our partners Indonesia, local villagers. So this Sagaya River is one of the most sacred rivers in the island of Maluku, which is where the Weda Bay Industrial Park, IWIP, is located. Now, in 4 years' time, due to mining and smelting of nickel, this is the river has turned from clear and blue to now mostly brown and dirty. Now, some would argue, especially some of the companies would argue, that the color of the river turned brown is just, this is just soil, and this is not anything dangerous or toxic. But in fact, we have like evidence from local NGOs. They did testing in partnership with universities and academics Indonesia, and they found that these waters are contaminated with heavy metal, such as mercury, high levels of heavy metal. So this is not just salt, this is toxic substances. So from 2019 to 2023, villagers can no longer use this area as, for instance, water activities or fishing due to mining activities and the nickel industrial parks activities. Now, I wanted to highlight coal power plants. So as many of you know, nickel is essential to the climate transition because it is a critical part of EV cars, renewable energy storage facilities. However, all of these parks in Indonesia at the moment are powered by coal power plants. So that is really ironic. In IMIB alone, which is the industrial park on the left-hand side of the map that I showed you earlier, they have 18 units of coal power plants. And in IWIB, the other one, they have, once fully operational, they would have 14 units, and they would use coal more than Brazil or Spain in one single year. So that is really crazy, and that really goes against what we're trying to achieve with EV cars and renewable energy. Now, moving from the environmental impacts to social impacts, what we witness on the ground is devastating consequences for local villagers' health and livelihood. This photo was taken just 2-3 days after I left Indonesia last year. They experienced one of the worst flooding in 4 to 5 years' time due to deforestation. People, like, this is the road they would use on a daily basis to go to school, go to work, and this is what it looked like last year in August. Health is a big issue locally as well. They are seeing respiratory infections and skin rashes surge in local villages. And from the interviews that I conducted with local villagers, they know that they are getting more and more skin rashes. They know the air is not clean, but they don't have the financial resources to go to the doctors or even just get a really simple mask to protect themselves and their children. In terms of livelihoods, because there is so much land clearing and, again, water and air pollution, their way of lives has been destroyed. For instance, some of the villagers, they depended on fishing. Now there are no more fish in the nearshore area. So either you need more fuel, you need better resources, better boats to go much further out to the sea to catch fish, or you have to find other ways of living. This woman on my slide on the right-hand side, I spent 2 hours with her in this lake, Sagaya River, to pick shellfish. We spent 2 hours in there, but they usually spend up to 8 hours in this river. And at the time I was there, the water was up to the thighs, sometimes it's up to the waist, just to collect shellfish that could help the family survive. And the woman, the woman in the other photo, her husband used to go fishing near shore, and the entire family depended upon that. And however, because they would need to go further offshore, her husband crashed with one of the coal ships and died a couple of years ago. So now she tries to sell rubbish, and she buys, she makes some small snacks for the workers now working at the industrial parks to make a living. What's also been violated on the ground is indigenous people's rights. The man on the left-hand side, he's an indigenous person who came to Taiwan, in fact, just earlier this month to protest against the Taiwanese companies that is also operating in Indonesia, to ask them for better environmental protection and protection of indigenous people's rights. Now, again, it's similar to the community members. There's a matter of loss of traditional livelihoods. There's air and water pollution. And what's more, what's been reported, I think, by The Guardian, is that uncontacted tribes are now exposed to the outside world because mining companies are intruding upon their lands. So they're facing a risk of disease and cultural erasure. And this quote I have here, I think it's really shocking. It was from one of the indigenous peoples that visits Taiwan. They say that the story of nickel, as we outsiders understood it, it's about EV cars, it's about a greener future. But however, for them, it's not at all. They don't have electricity cars in their villages, but rather their land is dug up for these electric cars that they don't have. This is just to show that this indigenous people's violations is also becoming more and more serious because they are being criminalized by the government as well. Just in a few months ago, 11 people were arrested for protecting their land in Maluku, near Weda Bay Park. And then on labor rights, the situation is also really bad. They have really high death and injury records. They have inadequate safety equipment. One of the Indonesian community members who visited Taiwan earlier this month was also a worker. And he said that they have to buy masks for themselves because the company aren't providing them with any. And also what has been banned in many countries around the world, asbestos, they're still being used in Indonesia in these factories, and that they most of them they fear coming forward and raising issues, voicing their concerns to the public because of retaliation. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to stop there. This is going to be my last page. So all of us are trying to find solutions for what's going on in these industrial parks, because we're not like community members aren't saying no to nickel, no to development. They know what's going on with climate change. They know this is produced for electric cars, for renewable energy storage, but some of them are asking for better protection for the environment and for labor and for the people there, for this thing to move forward properly. So first and foremost, we would definitely advise meaningful engagement with communities and NGOs, really understand what's happening there and what they need. And also definitely no more coal expansions. That really goes against the cause. So invest more in renewable energies. And at the policy level, we do believe in stronger support for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence from the host countries would definitely help what's going on the ground in the host countries. And also, if there are any investors online or people who work with investors and financiers, do work collectively with each other and to have an impact on these multinationals operating in Indonesia for better human rights and environmental protection over there. So that is all from me now. Looking forward to our discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Xin Xuan, for your presentations. Bring us the impacts, not only social impacts, but also environmental impacts of some minerals extraction projects that is happening in Indonesia. So thanks again. And then right now we will have our next presenter, Matthew from the UN Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute for his presentations that is about some recent work from his office. So Matthew, now you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks, Sun, for that presentation. Quite sober in. But yeah, thanks, Carbon Cap, for having me here. So for those not familiar with our work, UNICRI is a UN research and training institute. Let's see if I can move the slides. Yes, and we focus our work on crime prevention, and improving criminal justice systems. In the past decade, we have focused quite heavily on environmental crimes and specifically illegal mining of gold and trafficking of precious metals. But we have increasingly focused specifically on critical energy transition minerals in line with UN priorities. Today, I want to present some highlights from the study that we conducted last year for Southeast Asia. And this was a study based on surveys and insights and interviews with civil society organizations, journalists, and law enforcement. So our focus is very much trying to improve governance and the policies of customs authorities to prevent illegal trafficking. And these are actors that are doing really critical work on the front lines, really with often limited resources. And as we've discussed, I mean, the contradiction, the paradox of the energy transition is that it is very much shaping to be mineral intensive. To meet the Paris agreements, the world will need four times more minerals by 2040. And I always use the analogy of an EV car. An EV car requires 200 kilograms more critical minerals than a combustion engine car. And Southeast Asia is really central to this story. Indonesia, as we've discussed, is the world's largest producer of nickel. Myanmar, a key supplier of heavy rare earth materials. Vietnam has the second largest reserve of rare earth globally. But despite this, there are still, despite the potential, a lot of these reserves are still unexplored. I think Philippines only it's 5% of its resources have been explored. Despite this big economic potential that the region has. But of course, the economic promise brings systemic risk, from the exclusion of communities to pressure on fragile governance systems. And so really, maybe to frame the discussion as well for the Q&A, when we talk about critical minerals, I think it's important to not just see them as commodities, but increasingly they're becoming assets of geostrategic value. And we see this in the news every day with trade deals and influencing really politics on a large scale. And so what we see in terms of criminal incidents, from illegal mining to permit frauds to environmental violations, are often not isolated accidents, but symptoms of a larger criminal ecosystems. And so that's why for us it's really important to look at the political ecology of corruption. So to really understand what are the incentives, what are the governance frameworks that shape how these minerals are mined and then traded. And we've seen this in the past with other mining booms. There's a drive to develop the sector quickly. And this means sometimes prioritizing production over oversight, which opens the door to crime. And worldwide, I mean, new industrial mines usually take 10 years to become operational. And so in response to the growing demand, some companies may resort to corrupt practices to accelerate the process. And there was also a study a couple of years ago that showed how out of 5,000 critical energy projects worldwide, 54% of these were situated near or on the grounds of indigenous people. And so often these are peoples whose rights are then trampled over. Here you see a very simplified diagram of a supply chain. I think it's very important to note that it's difficult to kind of really understand the full scope of criminal activities along the supply chain because we're dealing with minerals that are very different from each other. So copper is often blended across mines and smelter. Nickel can come from small-scale artisanal mines to large-scale and often mined with other ores. Rare earth elements are highly concentrated in specific regions, which means that a handful of refineries might be supplied by a dozen of small producers, which makes traceability difficult. But for analytical purposes, we've kind of divided the crimes through three main types. So you have the crimes happening at the exploration extraction level. So here you have human rights violations, violation of national rules. And then you have the crimes that happen along the supply chain, and this includes smuggling and trafficking, money laundering and theft. And then really corruption is the overarching enabler for all the other crimes across the supply chain. So in terms of our study in Southeast Asia, I'll just present kind of three highlights and mention some examples, and I'll share the report in the link. So you can see the case studies in more detail. But really, compared to other regions where you might see smaller artisanal illegal mining operations, in Southeast Asia, often illegal mining is embedded within formal enterprises, concealed under the appearance of legality. And this is because many critical minerals, as we've seen in Indonesia, require significant investment, advanced technology, and industrial scale extraction. So corporate actors really are central players, and they may use their legal facade to commit a wide range of violations, bribing officials to obtain concessions, ignoring labor standards, dumping waste illegally. And paradoxically, what we see in the region, you have policies that are intended to protect domestic value. So Indonesia, for example, banned the export of nickel. And this is to protect the value chain domestically, but sometimes it can actually fuel smuggling and fraud. And the minerals are then smuggled to dodge export controls. We see this in Malaysia, for example, where we actually spoke with law enforcement that uncovered an operation where you had a group of people who were illegally trafficking rare earth materials disguised as fertilizers or clay. And then it was being shipped to nearby ports. And the Ministry of Mining in Malaysia actually said that between 2021 and 2023, up to 84% of their exports did not have valid permits or traceability. And this is also because sometimes the custom agents don't actually have the training to identify these materials, so which makes detection really complicated. Corruption, as we've mentioned, really undermine every stage of the supply chain, from licensing to inspection to transport. And weak oversight allows unqualified operators to conceal illicit trade. There are many case studies in the report. In Vietnam, we see last year, actually, authorities seized more than 13,000 tons of illegally extracted ore. And the operation included a former deputy environmental ministry. So you often have the collusion of high-level authorities. Indonesia, we've talked about. But again, here you see really the impact, as we've mentioned, on the environment that's really severe. You see scarred landscape, damage of the marine ecosystems. And we'll mention it maybe in the Q&A, but Indonesia has actually in response tried to pilot this new traceability system so they can have an overview of where the mineral is at each stage of the supply chain to see how effective it will be. And of course, Myanmar is a big example of how often we just have no traceability. Myanmar is the leading source in the world of rare earth materials, but it's really invisible in discussions of mineral integrity, because a lot of the mining happens along Myanmar's border with China. And since the coup there, mines are under contested control between military-aligned forces and opposition groups, and there's no regulatory oversight. So you'll see ore trucked overland into China, where it's blended and processed, and making traceability nearly impossible. And journalists and activists really don't have access, and data is really scarce. And so often investigations have to rely on satellite images and intricate and complicated corporate and customs analysis. And so this is a big issue, because a lot of the minerals coming from Myanmar are ending up in our phones and laptops, but we have no idea how they were mined. And then something else that we were told in our kind of in-person meetings from enforcement actors is that often in a lot of the countries there's no coordination between different enforcement agencies, so mining ministries, financial investigative units, anti-corruption bodies, and customs. They repeatedly told us that they're being asked to carry out high-stakes enforcement with limited data, not enough training, and resources. And as we've seen, really, a lot of the investigations are coming from civil society actors and brave journalists that step in to fill this enforcement gap, but they're facing increasing threats, defamation lawsuits, and really restriction on access to vital information. And so very, very quickly, I mean, what's happening globally that is relevant? I mean, from the UN, you have this UN Secretary General panel on critical energy transition minerals, which was launched about a year ago. And this panel has proposed kind of 7 principles that should drive the transition. And specifically, they also recommend a comprehensive global traceability mechanism. So what do we mean by traceability, really? Good traceability, effective traceability should lie on 4 principles, really, or should have 4 components. You should be able to know where the material, the mineral is coming from. You should know how it's traveled via different processing sites. You should have a chain of custody, so understand who owns or handles the materials at each stage, and understand its physical evolution, how it's transformed. So I mentioned Indonesia has this Simbada digital initiative, which started off with tracking just gold and tin, but now they've expanded it to nickel. So that is an example, but the key message from our end is that traceability is needed, but it's not enough. It's not the same as responsibility. It's really the entry point for a broader process of identifying and addressing potential adverse impacts. So conducting a real due diligence. So you can have a product that is perfectly traceable, but if due diligence is not conducted by the company, then you may never actually discover that it was produced with child labor, for example, or through environmental extraction. So it's important not to have a one-size-fits-all approach. And in interest of time, I'll conclude. I mean, this was the diagram that we put in the study, kind of listing some of the potential solutions. But very quickly, as I mentioned, really holding corporations accountable is key, but it's difficult without clear and enforceable legal frameworks. A lot of these companies are not liable, criminally speaking, and so we need more efforts to hold corporations accountable. And then it's really important to follow the money. So really important to enhance financial investigations, because often investigations will focus on small-scale miners or informal miners that are not the root of the problem. They don't go after the big fish. And that's important given the transnational and transregional nature of these crimes. And lastly, as we've discussed, it's really important to empower communities and local indigenous groups. Often, even if they are consulted, they're not properly consulted. Often it's just a facade. So really important to put them at the center of any policy responses. So I'll conclude there, but happy to discuss in detail after. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for your presentation. Bring to us the challenges that currently we are facing, and also the key message that it is important to have these minerals traceable, to hold the companies accountable, and also for the companies to conduct the real due diligence. Thanks again, Matthew. And then lastly, we have Paul Choi from Business and Human Rights Resources Center. Paul Choi will talk a bit about the work of his center and also his experience or insights from his work. Paul Choi, can you have the floor, please?
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Oh, sorry about that. Let me try that again. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. Maybe we need to wait a bit. Or Paul Choi, maybe can you try again?
Let me try again.
Yeah, it's open now.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me for this session to represent the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So just very quickly before diving into my presentation, just like to introduce the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. We are a global organization and we track and monitor human rights impacts, both positive and negative, globally. And these human rights impacts that we track are related to business activities. So I'm the Southeast Asia program manager. So I'm basically oversee and monitor the research in Southeast Asia. I just wanted to show you as well some of our research products on just transition that you might want to take a look at our website, business-humanrights.org. So we have a renewable energy and human rights benchmark, and several briefings on electric vehicle nickel supply chain, which I will discuss today, and also the transition minerals tracker. This is the 2024 analysis, but we have a new one that was just recently published. Excellent presentations from my co-panelists, but just wanted to step back into a wider space, looking at the global scenario in terms of human rights impacts, because they're sort of comparable to what's happening in Asia. So these are the key findings on our 2025 analysis of our transition minerals tracker. So our transition minerals tracker, we look at the human rights impacts that are associated with the mining of transition minerals such as bauxite, cobalt, copper, which is the mineral that's associated with the highest number of allegations, lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc. And this year, we also tracked allegations related to mining of iron ore, which is a key mineral in the manufacturing of renewable energy infrastructures. So for the period of 2010 to 2024, so 14 years, we've tracked 835 allegations globally of human rights abuse in the mining of transition minerals, and this included 157 attacks against human rights defenders. And in 2024 alone, we recorded 156 allegations. So as I mentioned, 157 attacks against human rights defenders, so they continue to pay the highest price in defending their rights in their community. So that's nearly 20% of the allegations. And 25 of those allegations are related to strategic lawsuits against public participation, where human rights defenders are basically filed frivolous lawsuits to disable them to assert their rights and the community's rights. And here you can also see that there's 2,700 plus impacts in total. It's a bit confusing because I mentioned 835 allegations, but the impacts are sort of the allegations of abuse are highly multifaceted, and one allegation can be associated with more than one impact, hence the bigger number of impacts. So this may relate to different groups, different individuals per allegation. So hence the 2,700 impacts in total. And if you look at the diagram, local communities impacts are the highest with the 1,143. And then the top impacts in 2024, and if you remember the earlier presentations, they're sort of aligned with our findings. So in 2024, it's 56 impacts relate to clean and healthy, sustainable environment, water pollution, and with that impacts on livelihood, and so forth. So again, looking at the data on environmental impacts, you see that there are 258 impacts on clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, water pollution, and related to that is, of course, access to water. Labor is also impacted in the mining of transition minerals, and most of the impacts relate to occupational health and safety standards. And we see this in the mining of nickel in Indonesia. I think it was also mentioned in the earlier presentation. Some worker-related deaths also happen in the mining sites. And on local communities, I mentioned attacks on human rights defenders, impacts on livelihood when mining comes in It totally changes the landscape. So it impacts the livelihood, land rights, and also the health of the people near the mining sites. So zooming back into the Asia and Pacific. So this is just some of the data that we've gathered throughout the years from 2010 to 2025. You can see that there was in Asia. Oh, I forgot to mention that globally, the Asia and Pacific account for 15% of the allegations. So we're ranked third in the world, following South America and Africa and the Middle East. So as you can see from this graph, of course, our data collection has also evolved throughout the year. So this may not be a complete picture or comprehensive accounting of allegations, but from our methodology, there was really an uptick in terms of number of allegations from 2020 to up until this point. But of course, we're still in the middle of the year, and we're still collecting our data. In terms of allegations per country, as mentioned, Indonesia is really a hotbed in terms of violations right now, especially nickel mining, because as I will discuss later, Indonesia has really developed their domestic processing, and that's really the push of the government. Sadly, it's sort of continuing trend that we're seeing. And yeah, in terms of allegations per group, human rights defenders, communities, and workers are the three top groups that experience the impacts of mining. So we also did I think this was 2 years ago, we did a study on Chinese overseas investment. And so these are allegations that are linked to Chinese investment. And in the Asian Pacific, Indonesia also tops the most number of allegations. And in Asia Pacific, there were 102 allegations. I mentioned that we conducted studies on the electric vehicle nickel supply chain. I think a lot has been said on Indonesia already. So in 2023, we mapped just an example of a supply chain of nickel being sourced from Indonesia and the Philippines. So this is one of the supply chain maps that we've come up with based on research from other local organizations and international organizations as well. This one was the latest one, focused on Indonesia, looking at the nickel mining in the small islands in Indonesia, Wawoni'i Island and Cabena in Southeast Sulawesi, and how it's connected to battery manufacturers and electric vehicle companies. So yeah, I think I'll just quickly, since a lot has been said on Indonesia, just to sort of contrast what's happening in the Philippines. We are experiencing the same impacts here in mining affected communities in terms of water pollution, access to water, violation of FPIC, violation of indigenous people's rights. But I think it would be good to differentiate. In Indonesia, they have a thriving in terms of business industry on domestic processing, because the government has successfully banned the export of raw nickel compared to, say, for example, the Philippines. It's mostly extractive. The nickel ores are once mined, shipped elsewhere to Japan, to China for mineral processing. In Indonesia, the processing happens. Some of the processing happens within the country, And so there has been the development of these industrial parks that Shin-Sean mentioned in EWIP and EMIP, also in Southeast Sulawesi, and several others are being developed right now for the domestic processing. So I think I'll end there, but just very quickly, I think in terms of challenges, what we're really seeing is, it's sort of, the mining is still like a top-down approach, where big business and governments work hand in hand to mount these land-intensive human rights risky projects with little to no consultation. And I think Matthew also mentioned the prevalence of corruption, and I think that ties to the top-down approach, and just prioritizing profit over the rights of people on the ground, and we see also weak institutional safeguards. Some of the agencies that are tasked to safeguard the rights of, say, for example, indigenous peoples are very weak in the power ladder. So that's why there's weaker protections for local communities. And forgot to mention some of these, in some countries, the state security forces also act as the security guards. In the Philippines, that happens in Myanmar also, of these companies. And so that adds to the attacks against the risks against human rights defenders, and also adds to the shrinking civic space that's happening within these countries. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul Choi, for your presentation about the checker from the Business and Human Rights Resources Center that show us the information and the data related to the allegations of human rights violations regarding to the critical minerals project, and also the situations in Indonesia and the Philippines. And thanks again for Shin-Sean, Matthew, and Paul Choi for your presentations as well. So for our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put your questions into the Q&A box so that we can address or discuss your questions afterward. But right now, I would like to have the first questions for our panelists. So after hearing from your presentations, we can see that the situation is quite complicated. And one of the reasons for such complication is because nearly all of these kind of critical minerals projects are cross boundary, cross countries. So that on one hand, we have the host countries from one country, and then we have the actual on the field operations in another countries. And then it really makes the law enforcement difficult. And so from your perspective, how we can make sure that the governments involved in all these countries really have the law enforcement and also make the companies accountable. So what's your insights or perspective? Anyone would like to start first? Yeah.
Maybe I can go first. So yeah, that's a very good question. It's true. That's why we do a lot of supply chain mapping, because the nickel, for example, or transition mineral that's being sourced from Asia is supplied to, for example, electric vehicle companies that are domiciled in countries, for example, in Europe, in Japan, South Korea. So there's really that transboundary issue, and I think for the most part, our strategy is really to pressure the brands or the buyers, because at least for my experience here in the Philippines, it's very challenging. I know pressuring the buyers has its own set of challenges, but prior to joining the resource center, I was a legal coordinator. I lawyered for indigenous peoples here in the Philippines, and accessing the justice system here is very tough. We filed the cases against mining companies, and it took more than 10 years. I'm being kind, actually. The one case was 20 years. And now it's on appeal. So this is a damages case. So I think the pressure point really is pressuring the buyers of the transition minerals who are domiciled in countries where relatively the justice system is more efficient, more effective, to hold them accountable in their jurisdictions. And there's good development that's happening in terms of human rights due diligence legislation that may have extraterritorial application. We're seeing some pushback there, but at least there's a start. So yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Of course, the best way is having an efficient justice system locally, but that's very challenging.
May I just follow up, and wholeheartedly agree. And I mean, coming from speaking in terms of the enforcement, a lot of the people working in national anti-corruption agencies or law enforcement, we often hear that they just lack the resources, like human resources, or even the instruments to do investigations, because we're talking about kind of large geographical areas, and you need to work with your neighbors regionally and internationally. And that is challenging, and it requires a lot of coordination and political will. But also, just to answer maybe Henry's question about what investors and buyers should do. I mean, as Pachoy already said, you need to look at the whole supply chain. But also there is the OECD due diligence guidance, which is not a binding kind of law, but it is being kind of enshrined in regional legislation more and more. And this is basically it's 5 steps for that provides basically a practical kind of roadmap for companies and investors to basically ask, like, does the company have a robust due diligence system? Is it identifying risks, including corruption exposure? Is it commissioning independent audits? And what we see is a lot of these audits are kind of just happening, they're not really happening on the ground. And then, it's really important to really demand disclosure of all payments, taxes, and have strong anti-money laundering protocols. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, thank you. If I may also jump in there, like I totally agree with Pachoy and Matthew as well. Like we have to start with the local governments. That's like ideal situation. But then also like putting pressure on the brand companies based in Europe or the US is also important as well. But one of the challenges that we're facing is that because the critical minerals from, say, Indonesia, in order to link that to someone in the US or some company in the US or Europe, that's a really long supply chain, and we don't really have the transparency there at the moment. So companies in countries, for instance, like Taiwan, we are much more midstream. So there's more support on stronger due diligence and stronger environmental human rights protections in these countries on these midstream companies, then we are much closer to where the violations are taking place. So there is a strong opportunity to, first of all, we can identify the connection. And secondly, when it comes to liability, it's easier to actually hold these accountable. Because usually when we talk about the brand companies, for instance, Tesla, or, the other known names, they are further downstream. Even if we can find the connection, we may not always be able to hold either them accountable or they don't always have enough leverage on what's happening on the ground in Indonesia. So sometimes I think mid companies play a really important role, and they are usually in Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, China. But then that's again another the elephant in the room that we have to talk about, but probably not today.
Thank you, all the presenters. And follow-up questions is that we have talked a lot about the impacts of the renewable projects. When it comes to approving or this kind of extraction, mining or processing projects, do we need to establish any rules before we get approved for these projects? And also, if these kind of rules or requirements are violated, not fulfilled, how we should deal with this kind of projects? Should we call them to stop their operations, fixing anything, or anything else? How we should deal with these kind of projects?
So I can have like a quick answer. What we're trying to do in Taiwan is when violations take place, or where there is serious risk of violations occurring, then we would ask the companies to temporarily halt operations, make sure they improve their response measures, and then whatever needs to be followed can happen later on. That is like something that we're advocating for in Taiwan. And another thing that I know is taking place, is happening in Indonesia, is, for instance, small islands. There is law in place that you should have this mining is not allowed on small islands, but that's not being implemented. So first of all, perhaps implement the laws, and then yeah, let me stop there and see if my fellow panelists also have not.
You want to go, Matthew? Sorry. Yeah. Exact. The last point of Shinchuan about having laws, but them not being implemented. I think that's, of course, it would be great to improve laws. For example, in the Philippines, there's the Mining Act, has been around since 1995. So it would be good to improve safeguards in relation to the law. But we have, for example, in our court system, we have this protective writ called writ of kalikasan. We have all sorts of injunctive relief that communities can access. But is it real access? Are these is there teeth to these pieces of legislation or these rules? We have an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, which gives power to, for example, our Indigenous Peoples Agency to facilitate FPIC, but they're sort of underfunded. They don't have the same power as, for example, the Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Finance. So there's problems with the amount of power they wield, and also the implementation of the laws.
Yeah, no, if I may add, I mean, I agree. And I think there is a momentum in terms of criminalizing harms that impact the environment. And there are discussions at the UN to add an additional protocol at the UN Convention against International Organized Crime. But again, the issue of corporate accountability is really the sticky point, and also traceability. There's Colombia, for example, is leading an initiative for a global framework on traceability for these transition minerals. But again, like, the political momentum is slow, and that's why you need involvement of and campaigning of civil society. Quickly, I mean, I saw there was a question also on waste, which I think we didn't really talk about, but I think that's key. Especially for Southeast Asia, where I understand that especially Vietnam, Malaysia are expected to generate thousands of waste coming from solar panel production, as they're trying to diversify from production in China. And in Europe, we see already solar panels that were built 20 years ago being smuggled as e-waste to West Africa, with a lot of environmental hazards. So I think that is key as well to take into account.
Thanks, Matthew, for answering the questions. Actually, there's one more question for you. I think it's about you have provided us a fresh perspective about that for us to see this kind of issues or impacts as the international crimes. So the question from Kevin is how can Southeast Asia establish a clear, reliable process to identify and address this kind of risks, and also work toward regional and global issues? Yeah.
It's an easy question. No, I mean, from my understanding, I mean, ASEAN as a intergovernmental body, they haven't really. I think maybe they have a new action plan coming up for the next 5 years. I think the previous one didn't really didn't have a specific focus on critical minerals. So I would say that is the avenue. From our perspective, yeah, it's about incentivizing cross-country border learning. And again, learning from other models. In Europe, for example, there's the EU Crime Directive on the environment that is coming into force next year. And there's also a regulation on digital passports for batteries, which will make companies kind of have to have a traceable supply chain for batteries. So yeah, I think yeah, given the potential, and we know that the critical minerals will be used for the region, I think there's an incentive to really strengthen governance mechanism. But maybe yeah, the other panelists have more to say on this.
Yeah.
So
yeah, Pushpa, please go ahead.
So yeah, ASEAN, as far as I know, working with the ICHR, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, has been developing the declaration on the right on environmental rights. So that may touch upon the issue surrounding the mining of transition minerals. But ASEAN, I think it's it's good that representatives in the region are talking to establish these standards, but it's very challenging in ASEAN because there's also rules on non-interference, where countries don't really meddle with the domestic affairs of the members. And but we're seeing some developments in Asia, and again other parts of the world, because you really need everyone, countries also in the West, to have human rights due diligence laws that will correspond with the laws in the host countries where impacts are happening. But we're seeing development in terms of human rights due diligence legislation in Indonesia, for example, in Thailand, and there's been consultations in the development of the human rights due diligence law there. Japan as well, and South Korea, we're seeing a push for human rights due diligence rules or legislation.
Thank you, Pushpa and Matthew, for your insights. So Matthew just shared a report on the chat room about the publications that his office recently published, and also he just made the presentations. And maybe just the final questions for our panelists. So a lot of impacts we see is happening in the community on the ground, and very often the indigenous people or the communities, villagers in the communities, they may not object to the project itself, but very often they also want to contribute to the planning or the design of the project, so to minimize the impacts of the project, or even have some positive things to the community. So how can we make sure the communities have their voice heard by the companies or by these kind of in these operations, in these projects? How we can maximize the voices from our communities?
I can chime in really quickly. I think this is like the $1 million question. Like everyone is trying to find a way for effective and meaningful engagement with the communities, indigenous peoples, and the rights holders. One of the things that we've tried, and quite successfully actually this month, was that we've invited community members from Indonesia on the ground that impacted to Taiwan and had an actually a high-level dialogue with management of the company that are in fact operating there. So in this instance, communities and NGOs, we took initiative, right? But I think what companies can follow up with is for in the future, they can be the one who takes initiative and even establish a routine way, an effective way of communicating with these rights holders. But this is just one instance. And I think in the future, what others could do is starting with, I think there was questions about what investors and financiers could do. I think they can leverage, you can leverage your portfolios and have them present what their engagement with the communities look like. Like there are also guidance with OECD and many other large international NGOs that would show you what meaningful and effective engagement would probably look like. I think this is definitely always a case-by-case situation, like never one size fit all, but starting there, like at least we can start somewhere, right? And then we can figure out when the dialogue starts, then we can figure out how to do better. That's like what I have to say for now.
Matthew and Paul Choi, do you want to jump in for this question?
Yeah, very quickly. Something that came out from our consultations is that you have free prior informed consent that is used, but a lot of communities actually see it less as a means of genuine participation, but more as a tool to legitimize projects where they have little influence over. And so there's interesting developments in terms of emerging indigenous-led protocols, which are rooted in customary laws and allow communities to define consultation processes on their own terms. So I think strengthening these mechanisms, so focusing not just on preventing manipulation, but also actively supporting these communities, which are key, and that's where most of the information we have in terms of the crimes happening on the ground come from, is really important. So that would be my recommendation. Thanks.
So yeah, just to add, I think a good starting point would be looking at the UNGPs, which is sort of like universally regarded as the standard for human rights in business. Even corporations acknowledge this. And in the UNGPs, there are provisions on human rights impact assessments, which requires consultation procedures to happen before a project and even during the project when during certain milestones of a project. So that's a good start. I already mentioned that, for example, in the Philippines, we actually have an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, but the implementation is weak. So yeah, I think it also boils down to political will and empowering these agencies to for communities to be protected under the law.
Thank you. So time is running short, so we will have to conclude these panel discussions. Thanks again for Xin Xuan, Matthew, and Paul Choi for your wonderful presentations and also discussions about the impacts of the critical minerals projects and also what different stakeholders can leverage their resources, their power to make the impacts on the ground, and also what kind of frameworks the companies or the communities can make use of to try to have some improvements for this project. Thanks again for all the panelists, and for our audience, our next sessions, the Inspire Talk Youth-led Solar Solutions will start right after. So please stay and also change to virtual room so that you will be able to listen from the youth in the region about their solar solutions. Thanks again, all of you, and hope to see you again later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.